Hello and welcome on Africanews. I am Ruth Lago. Business Africa's headlines this week. The economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa in the third quarter of 2021 outdid the projections. What's behind this surprise rebound when the continent grappled with effects of COVID and conflicts? From a 3.8% economic growth in 2020 to 7.2% in 2021, Benin has experienced a spectacular growth according to the latest figures from the National Institute for Demographic Studies and Statistics. Lastly, Uganda, thanks to the wide range of tourist attractions, the country reported a record boom in domestic tourism. This growth could help reduce unemployment rate in the long run. According to the International Monetary Fund latest report on economic prospects for sub-Saharan Africa, 2022 will be less appealing. The body is concerned about a potential food crisis and states barely have any leeway. One achievement in 2021, however, is worth noting. Sub-Saharan Africa recorded a slight growth. The sub-Saharan African economy grew in 2021, recording a 4.5% rise, where in 2020 the IMF forecast a 3.7% growth. The country's GDP rates for the third quarter of 2021 were better than expected, and economic activity withstood the effects of the spread of the Omicron variant. One of the countries which contributed to the growth is Ethiopia. Its economy had steadied despite the blow of the pandemic, a conflict in Tigray, and a locust upsurge. The lifting of lockdowns in South Africa took the strain off the economy, especially after historic civil riots in July 2021. However, these figures hide discrepancies between countries and regions, and security issues in the Sahel trigger fears of a food crisis. The International Monetary Fund advocated boosting the vaccination campaign and urged African nations to find a middle way between inflation and economic growth. Continental leaders also have to keep a watchful eye on the risk of a looming debt crisis. Moreover, the international body recommended to direct public funds towards health and social sectors. To get more on this, Sir Bebe Selassie joins us. He is the director of the African Department at the International Monetary Fund in Washington. Thank you for being with us. We've just heard it in this report. Sub-Saharan Africa recorded a 4.5% growth in 2021, when over the same period it grappled with the pandemic, drought and conflicts in the Sahel. What accounts for this rebound?
2021 was a year when economies were recovering from the pandemic. And usually when you have a recovery from a very sharp contraction, as we saw in 2020, you would expect much higher growth. So the fact that growth was going to be expanding at 3.7 wasn't necessarily a good thing. In the end, we ended up at 4.5% in 2022. So yes, the pandemic was affecting outcomes. We had several countries where there was a drought, but it was also should have also have been a rebound year, and ideally growth would have been much higher still. And 4.5 was nice, and it looked like going into 2022, many countries had a nice growth momentum.
These figures hide the bleak reality of poverty and the debt crisis some states faced. Your institution recommended that nations direct public funds towards the social sector, but inflation is still on the rise.
Here, governments find themselves in a very, very difficult position. Continuing to subsidize will cost a lot of money. So the question we highlight, and the trade-offs we highlight is fuel price subsidies in general tend to benefit richer households more than poorer households. Okay, why? Because they tend to have the big cars that they drive. They tend to, drive more cars in the households, bigger houses that they need to provide electricity for, etc. So the question is and the more governments are spending money here, it's the more that they're subsidizing richer households. The challenge for our countries is resources being limited. Do you want to spend this more on building more schools, more education facilities, or do you want to spend it on subsidizing fuel for richer households?
Let's touch on the special drawing rights system. Only $23 billion have been allocated to about 50 countries. Why hasn't the initial $100 billion pledge been fulfilled yet? And what do you plan to do?
For sub-Saharan Africa, since March 2020, we have provided $50 billion in financing. 23 billion through the SDR allocation that you noted, another 26 billion through other forms of financing instruments that we have, and close to $1 billion for debt relief for the poorest countries in our region. The point you made about SDR allocation and this 100 billion target, the 23 billion is actually the SDRs that were outright allocated to African countries. So that is not part of the 100 billion package. So the idea is to move 100 billion from these countries with better positions towards countries that are in more vulnerable position. With respect to that, actually, there's been a lot of progress that has been made.
High debt levels are an indisputable burden on sub-Saharan African economies. Is it not about time to cancel it? Some states have made repeated calls.
The key is understanding, and this can only be done on a country-specific basis, understanding what the debt situation is. Wherever debt vulnerabilities are so high and debt pressures are so high, then of course, ways need to be addressed. And then comes the question, who is this debt owed to? What are the creditors? Do you need a reprofiling or an actual restructuring? So, the work we do on a day-to-day basis, even in normal times, much less at a time like this, is of course to discuss with each country and help them address their challenge.
Sir Bebe Selassie, Director of the African Department at the IMF, thank you.
Thank you.
It's what you can call a spectacular growth. Benin recorded a 7.2% economic growth in 2021. How did the West African country achieve this boom? Our correspondent in Cotonou, Romeo Adviso, has more on this story.
It's lunchtime in a makeshift restaurant at the University of Abomey, Calavi. Auguste Tusu, a student, is enjoying his cum dish, a meal made with corn and fish. But the inflation of food prices has made his portion small. The quantity of cum is not like before. Even fish has decreased. Everything is now expensive. These complaints are nowadays recurrent in Benin, yet the country has recorded an economic growth rate of 7.2% according to statistics from INSTAD, the National Institute of Statistics and Demography. For economists, the Beninese contradictory performance can be explained. When we talk about economic growth, we must say that it is an average. Of course, there are some who have benefited from this growth, but there are others who may not have benefited, and in their case, the situation will continue to be bad. From 3.8% in 2020, Benin's economic growth rate increased to 7.2% in 2021, despite the damage caused by COVID-19. According to INSTAD, the good performance was driven by the tertiary sector. With the lifting of barriers or their mitigation, we were no longer strict. This allowed us to boost the tertiary sector, which rose to 3.2%. And this is what has made the sector alone contribute to nearly 44% of economic growth. This is why we have achieved a 7.2% growth rate. The performance achieved by Benin can also be explained by the reforms introduced by the government through the innovation of standardized invoices to reduce tax evasion.
Let's look at another success story. This time we're heading to Uganda, where the tourism sector helped reduce the unemployment rate during the COVID lockdowns. A growing number of Ugandans are visiting natural parks and the renowned Lake Victoria.
Uganda's tourism sector is surviving the pandemic with the help of the local holidaymakers. Businesses have seen a surge in domestic tourists as foreign visitor numbers have plummeted. The Ugandan government says it is actively promoting the parks and wildlife to get Ugandans to holiday in their own country.
Looking at the numbers we're getting, 70 to 65% are local Ugandans. And again, COVID opened our eyes. I mean, you cannot depend on foreign tourists anymore. So charity begins at home.
One of the biggest barriers for Ugandans is the cost of visiting such places. So the government has allowed more competition in a bid to drive prices down.
From the time we opened up, if you look at the December figures, for instance, around 41,000 people visited the national parks, just the protected areas. We're not talking about the others, the Lake of Bunyonyi, the islands, but just the protected areas. Around 41,000 people visited. But the biggest percentage for the first time were Ugandans, which had never happened before. So it's very promising, and we hope that as we continue our focus on the domestic market, definitely the numbers will grow.
The boom in the tourism sector is also helping to bring down unemployment levels brought about during Uganda's pandemic lockdowns. For places like Wild Waters, giving jobs to the local community is a major key for sustainability.
That does it for this edition of Business Africa. You can follow us on our platforms, Africanews in French and in English. I'll see you soon.
À bientôt.